Thank you very much. I want to thank Andy Winnick and the Institute for the chance to be with you here tonight, and also for the chance to meet my fellow panelists and get a chance to talk with them this evening. I'm a historian, so I'd like to begin by explaining what that means for me in relation to the issue of Latino poverty, which is the topic that I've been asked to speak to you tonight about. For me, and probably for many people in my profession, historians are primarily storytellers. We construct stories about the past by investigating the documents that humans created as they lived through that past. Well, on one level, those stories tell us what happened in the past. The work of the historian really, from many of our perspectives, is much more about explaining what's important about what happened in that past. In that way, the stories that we construct about the past are inseparable from our understanding of the present. Our value judgments about what is important in the past are necessarily framed by our understanding about what's important in the here and now. We tell stories that explain how we got to where we are, even explain how we avoided other possible futures that could have grown from the past. All this is to say that as a historian, I'm intimately concerned about the present and the future as much as I'm concerned about the past. And so an explanation of that present and future, the one that informs my work, is a necessary starting point. There are approximately 53 million Latinos in the United States right now, representing about 17% of the overall population. While migration has been the historical foundation of that Latino population in the U.S., the present-day population is overwhelmingly U.S. born. 65% of all Latinos are born in the United States. Latinos hail from a diversity of places in the Spanish-speaking hemisphere, places with their own histories of race and colonization, making them a diverse group in and of themselves. But that diversity is not evenly represented inside of the United States. Again, the overwhelming majority of Latinos trace their roots to only one of two places. About 63% are Mexican by ethnicity, and about 10% are Puerto Rican, meaning that 3 out of every 4 Latinos are from these two places alone. The remaining 26% have roots in El Salvador, Guatemala, the Dominican Republic, and a host of other Spanish-speaking countries inside of the hemisphere. Latinos are, and my McGraths aren't as good as hers, but I'm not a demographer, so my apologies. Latinos are concentrated in only a handful of the states. Literally a majority live in only 3 states. 55% of the entire population of Latinos lives in California, Texas, and Florida combined. Taking into account just a few more states, 76% of all Latinos live in just 9 of the 50 states. The 3 I mentioned above, as well as New York, Illinois, Arizona, New Jersey, Colorado, and New Mexico. Now that list isn't surprising to us. It's a product of history. Each of these states has traditionally served as either an immigration gateway in general for everybody in the United States, but specifically the majority of those 9 as immigration gateways for people from Mexico and Puerto Rico, the 2 predominant Latino migratory movements of the 20th century. But the foundation of this gateway status, at least in the case of the 5 southwestern states, is the long history of Mexicans in that region. The history that predates the historical phenomena of Latino migration. After all, this was Mexico before it was the United States. The present-day Latino population is not just about history. In the first decades of this new 21st century, Latinos accounted for 56% of the nation's total population growth. This means that Latinos are very much the foundation of this country's demographic future as well. That present-day growth is not confined to the Southwest either. Over the last decade, the 10 states with the highest growth rates of Latinos are all outside of these traditional immigration gateway states, with the top 8 located in the south of the United States. And while most Latino immigrants continue to be from Mexico, the population growth from other parts of the hemisphere has been astronomical. From 2000 to 2010, just according to census figures, the Salvadoran population in the U.S. grew by 152%. The Guatemalan population by 180%. The Dominican population by 85%, and Colombians by 93%. Now, at 17% of the total nation's population, Latinos are already the second largest racial ethnic group in the United States, second only to so-called non-Hispanic whites, who I'll just shortly just call whites for simplicity's sake. As this graph shows, though, by 2060, the U.S. Census projections suggest that Latinos will comprise nearly 30% of the U.S. total, compared to whites projected 43.6%. So Latinos are also the foundation of a much larger trend then unfolding or predicted to unfold in the 21st century United States, as U.S. whites continue to decline in their share of the overall population, and Latinos and non-white racial groups continue to grow. Already the majority of births in the United States are to non-white parents. By the time my elementary school age children reach middle age, they'll live in a country that is so-called majority minority, although those terms will cease to mean what they mean, obviously, where whites make up 37.8% of the population and everyone else makes up a projected 56.4%. Now, these numbers are important for us to grasp, I think. Latinos are currently less than 11% of registered voters in the United States, but they'll account for more than 40% of the growth in the electorate over the next 2 decades alone. They're 16% of the current labor force, but they'll account for more than 75% of its growth over the next decade. We're approaching a moment not too far off where to know the United States, it will be necessary to know Latinos in the United States. But our collective understanding as a nation is so underprepared for this future reality. Any history of Latino wealth or Latino poverty in the United States is shaped by this present and this future. It frames the urgency of our ability to better comprehend this pattern that's defined the 20th century experience of Latino history. How Latino history could be simultaneously integrated into U.S. society as Latino people were socially and politically marginalized. And I'll talk a little bit about that 20th century phenomenon now. Again, let me restate it because I tripped on a word, but how Latinos are at the same time simultaneously economically integrated in U.S. society, but politically and socially marginalized. There are more than 22 million Latinos over the age of 16 who are working in the United States today. For the first time in 20 years, a majority of them are U.S.-born Latinos rather than immigrants. While there are differences between Latinos based on their generational status, differences that I'll talk a little bit more about in a bit, the historical pattern for Latino workers has been fairly consistent over the last century. This photo is from the U.S.-Mexico border near San Diego in 1953. It looks like a lot of different things can be happening, but what is happening here are that U.S. border officers and other agents, employment agents, paid by the University of California system, are selecting able-bodied workers from Mexico to be distributed to various industries throughout the West and the Midwest. They were all part of what was generally referred to as the Bracero program, which began as a 1942 agreement between Mexico and the United States to import workers from the Mexican countryside to fill World War II labor shortages. Men were moved from rural regions throughout the Mexican countryside to various processing centers, first inside of the interior of Mexico. The population of one of those, very famously in Pomona in Sonora, would swell to more than 100,000 of workers waiting at these processing centers at its height. Only a few thousand men at a time were allowed to process northward to another processing center, this one located somewhere along the U.S.-Mexico border, like this one here. There, U.S. agents interviewed them and inspected their bodies, a modern-day version of the slave marketplace. One staff member said that they looked for callous hands and for strength, an ability to move, as they also tried to weed out those that seemed too educated or too uppity. At each stage of the process, only a smaller share than the total would be allowed to move on to the next phase. Even with that restrictive process, more than 4.6 million braceros were imported into the United States from 1942 to 1965, when the World War II program, was finally discontinued. Now, the history of the Bracero program sort of debunks the political excuses that secured its original passage. Southwestern agricultural interests in particular had long lobbied for such a program as their production expanded in the early 20th century. In the early 40s, World War II provided an opening for them. Mexicans needed to be imported, they said, to fill the labor shortages that were created by the war, as millions left the workforce to fight abroad or left their previous jobs to move upward or start to work for war industries at home. But braceros rarely filled actual wartime shortages. Most were employed in agriculture and light industry, performing jobs most often filled by Mexican Americans, African Americans, Mexican immigrants, and other racial minorities. While they sometimes replaced those other workers, braceros more often than not worked alongside them in their own separate work crews. The only wartime shortages braceros filled were the labor needs required to expand production to meet increased wartime demand. Indeed, the vast majority of braceros came to work in the United States after the conclusion of World War II. The program, as I mentioned, continued until 1965. It was extended in a series of public laws in the late 40s and early 50s. Braceros provided specific U.S. industries with a sustained labor pool for more than 20 years then. They were desired workers because they were cheap, because they were plentiful, and because they were replaceable. They were desired workers for all those reasons. They could be imported when they were needed and exported when they were not. They were also pliable laborers. They lacked political rights or any access to the law or political structure for protection. This diminished position reduced braceros' complaints relating to work conditions or low wages. To complain would be to ensure your removal from the job and your exportation back to Mexico. The chronic labor strikes of the fields in California in the 1920s and the 1930s all but disappeared in the years of the bracero program. This photo and the bracero program itself is a tragic yet vibrant demonstration of the contradiction of that Latino experience in the United States. Latinos are at once wanted and unwanted, desired and rejected, economically integrated but socially marginalized. This dynamic is at the heart of the historical experience of Latinos, whether bracero, immigrant, or U.S. born. Latino poverty grew in a social, political, and economic system that viewed Mexican labor as, in the words of one grower, children of the sun, able to do the work that white workers are neither suited to nor inclined to do. They were seen as inherently migratory, as people without ambitions towards things like citizenship or permanence. They were framed as idealized workers who were simultaneously not political subjects. The U.S. could harness their labor without worrying about their social inclusion overall. These are a few young boys in a Texas work camp in the 1940s. The 20th century Latino population grew on a mixture of migration and natural births. An immigrant majority of the early 20th century gave way to a U.S.-born majority as early as the 1940s. This shift in nativity was still within the same nuclear family structure. That is, most U.S.-born Latinos had one or more immigrant parents throughout mid-century. Not surprisingly then, both segments of this population lived in the same segregated spaces. Adults most often worked in racially segmented labor force, and children were educated in racially segregated and usually poorly funded schools. In 1970, a team of researchers, including some of the pioneers in Chicano studies, published this monumental demographic study on Mexican Americans in the Southwest. It was called the Mexican American People. They found that Mexican American workers, compared to the white American worker, earned less, was more likely to work in manual labor, lived in a more crowded residential condition, and was also less educated. The income disparities between these two groups, whites and Latinos, whites and Mexicans in particular, were not surprising when considering education levels and racial stratification inside of the workforce. For example, Mexican Americans were heavily clustered in the worst paying jobs in the United States, they found. By mid-century, nearly all the agricultural labor in the U.S. was performed by African American and Latino workers, for example. On the other hand, the post-World War II economy was undergoing a profound expansion at the top, positions that would be disproportionately filled by white workers. So in 1960, while 47% of white workers were employed in white-collar occupations, only 19% of Latino workers were. At the same time, only 26% of whites worked in jobs classified as manual labor, compared to a whopping 57% of Latino workers and 60% of African American workers. The researchers concluded that the diminished economic position of Mexican Americans was due to more than just the disparity in education rates or in job skills. The economic performance of Mexican Americans, like other racial minorities, was also shaped by profound discrimination in hiring and in pay and in access to resources that could build them as competitive workers in the marketplace. For example, on the question of education, Mexican Americans weren't just undereducated when compared to whites. When they were educated, it was usually in underfunded, worse-funded schools by comparison, or very often in discriminatory schools. This correlated into higher rates of systemic poverty for Latinos. By the 1960s, 35% of all Spanish surname families lived below that poverty line, compared to only 16% for whites. These researchers did observe an important trend in this period, though, something that gave them hope. The younger generation of Mexican Americans was exhibiting an increasing level of educational attainment overall. That shift was important. It meant that the late 20th century could provide something of a testing ground for the so-called American dream, right? After all, immigrant-dense populations are expected to be poorer than the average U.S. population. Traditionally, they come to the U.S. without much wealth, they work in low-wage sectors of the economy, and they do not possess the competitive advantages that U.S.-born workers do, things like an education, a language, and so forth. So that dream, that idea of movement forward and upward, should be realized by subsequent generations, not so much by that immigrant generation. So have Latinos experienced the American dream? Or has Latino poverty become a structural condition of the Latino experience in the United States? Well, late 20th century and early 20th century figures continue to present a very mixed but fairly problematic picture for the Latino general economic health. Today, as I mentioned, 22 million Latinos are participating in the workforce. A late century migration wave from Mexico and from other parts of Latin America meant that from the 80s until rather recently, most of those workers were immigrants. With the declining migration numbers recently and a wave of US-born Latinos entering the workforce, those numbers have again flipped. Now it's most Latinos working in the US, just over 50% are US-born. Those workers compare to whites in much the same way as did Latinos 50 years ago. Latino unemployment is higher than it is for whites, although Latinos tend to work more on average. They continue to earn a fraction of the wages earned by the average white worker. The average household income in the U.S. is about $51,000, give or take, and for Mexican households it's about $38,000. Educational attainment continues to lag, and Latinos continue to work in a labor market that seems just as racially stratified and segmented as it was before. They're the largest contingents of this nation's farm workers, groundskeepers, maintenance workers, and house cleaners, some of the lowest paying jobs in the country. These figures continue to be linked to an equally frightening educational portrait. African Americans and Latinos combined represent about 25% of this nation's workforce, yet they're 44% of its high school dropouts and earn only about 15% of its college degrees. More important than wages, or so I'm told, is the gap in accumulated wealth between Latino households and U.S. white households. In the present day, the median wealth of white households is 20 times that for Latinos, sort of what we saw on those previous charts. That gap got worse during this recent Great Recession. It doubled in that time period, when Latino households lost much of their wealth that they had accumulated over the previous generation. From 2005 to 2009, when adjusted for inflation, Latinos lost about 66% of their household wealth, compared to 16% for whites. Now, these figures are startling, but beneath them is also this sort of optimistic possibility, a story of hope, perhaps, one that was interrupted by that recent recession. That story becomes more visible when we look at the economic and social inclusion of the Latino population by generation over time. For example, only 35% of first-generation Latinos, that is the immigrant generation, for the way I'm using it, only about 35% of first-generation Latinos over the age of 25 are high school graduates. But those numbers improve over subsequent generations. They go from 35 to 64% of the second generation, over the age of 25 being high school graduates, and 71% of the third generation are. Now that same improvement occurs in terms of college attendance and graduation rates as well. Only 7.1% of the immigrant generation have attended some college. For the second and third generations, those numbers rise to 26 and 27%, give or take. But notice there's a little bit of a flatlining there between second and third generation. College graduation rates double between the first and second generation from 4.9 to 9.5%, and then only go up another percentage point for the third. In similar fashion, the wealth of Latino households, the wealth that Latino households lost during the Great Recession, represented wealth accumulated in the late 20th century. You had to accumulate it and close that gap in order to lose it during the Great Recession. Right? Wealth that had begun to then shrink that gap in wealth overall. Near the start of the recession, 55.4% of the second generation of Latinos were homeowners, compared to 43% of the immigrant generation. Before the recent downturn, homeownership rates for the third generation, which were about 62%, were approaching being comparable to that for overall white Americans. So the history of Latinos in the U.S. may be an indicator of our future. I think as we transform into that nation where the so-called minority becomes the majority, if the idealized American dream is going to continue to be a reality in the 21st century, then the United States is going to have to reckon with the wealth and opportunity disparities between U.S. whites and all other racial ethnic groups. Clearly, there are needs that are specific to the Latino population to make this happen. Comprehensive immigration reform and some form of a clear and realistic pathway to citizenship is not only a humanistic and a moral stance, it's also an economic one. This would give financial stability to millions of Latino households, allow for greater wealth accumulation, probably increase wages, and foster greater success for their children. A major effort to provide better K-16 education is another necessity. The success of the Latino baby boomers, this previous generation was able to accumulate some of that wealth, able to move into the middle class in higher numbers than their parents. And the success of that Latino baby boomer population was predicated on the unprecedented publicly financed expansion in public education in places like California. In this state, the state responded to the impending tidal wave of children, that is what they called that baby boom, that impending tidal wave of children by building new things for them, building new schools, training new teachers. They wrote the Master Plan of Higher Education in 1960, creating the finest public education system that civilization had ever known. All of it free or extremely low cost by comparison to today. The story of the recent past has been a nation and a state moving in this opposite direction. In the late 1990s, so-called Tidal Wave 2 was coming of age in California. Tidal Wave 2 was larger than Tidal Wave 1, larger than the baby boom numerically, anyways. This generation was educated in a public school system that was undergoing the attrition of a shrinking base of funding, where class size and teacher workloads were growing instead of resources. They entered a public higher education system where rising tuitions and an accompanying rising debt load became the norm. Why did we prepare so gallantly for the first rising wave of youth in the 50s and 60s and do so little as a society to prepare for the next one in the 1990s? How can we recreate the possibility and prosperity of a previous generation if we do not commit to investing in the future workers, leaders, and voters of our society? This is the present and the future that shapes the questions that I ask about the past and my explorations into it. Our challenge is not only to improve the economic standing of Latinos overall and to challenge the structures which have limited their full integration into U.S. society, it is by extension to improve the standing of the future working class and poor in this country. That rests in part on our collective ability to address the question, the very simple but long-asking question, who is American? And eventually to arrive at an answer that looks very much like the smiling faces pictured before you. So thank you very much. I look forward to questions and discussion later on.